In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head.
What's wrong with them? Tell me, is he okay?
He was pronounced dead at the scene.
My husband, can you tell me anything?
Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
Could have a seat right here, please?
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's house,
Get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am.
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hand, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something.
Stan picked up his gun, and the two went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him.
Oh my God, what happened?
She dialed
What happened,
911.
honey? Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, It irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is maybe...
I got some lady captain.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. She calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow. And possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Spear needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Spear spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case. Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Spear's theory. But even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos.
Over the right side.
He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. she was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over, take some pictures of that?
Stuff here, a lot of evidence. But the guy from the gas tankers.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions. It revealed that Plants suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Well, sure. Go
The
ahead.
beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz.
Over the back of the couch.
It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage, her financial situation, any enemies her husband may have had. Her answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation. It began to look as though Plantz may have been the victim of a random act of violence. Gibson persisted in the investigation.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plantz's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plantz was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plantz? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimball. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimball was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plantz to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plantz planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug. It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below. They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled blood stains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plantz's home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimball's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek had swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plantz's home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police.
Carpet in. We're going to get the washcloth and jeans.
There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plantz. Only then would Bryson and McKimball's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
But some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans, then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human anti-serum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plantz's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plantz's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimble, the murder occurred at Plantz's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plantz. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plantz's home, just as Bryson and McKimble had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plantz knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimble. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plantz's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plantz. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made two purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plantz had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plantz came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimble, were already there, waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the two men put the victim's body into his truck. Drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The three conspired to kill Mr. Plantz for the insurance money. McKimble did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other two were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plantz and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimble received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You make a right. Okay. So go left.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the Woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link.
The 2 pieces of chain link recovered from
The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his 2 older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parents' death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crutchley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. 2 former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hommick, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hommick had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hommick had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, "What are you going to do if he comes around?" And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hommick revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hommick in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hommick could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hommick, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hommick was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hommick's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hommick's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hommicks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hommick's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hommick's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. Investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hommick to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hommick was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hommick's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hommick wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hommick from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stri pattern.
What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stri patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hommick to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hommicks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hammock's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit.
Sorry.
That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neal and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neal and Stewart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neal and Stewart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hammock, life without parole, and Steve Hammock, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale. The press calls him the Hillside Strangler, but he may be part of a deadly duo. With little to go on, investigators face an uphill struggle as women continue to die. California's state parks contain hundreds of trails, but only one trailside killer. When the crime scene is as big as all outdoors, how can detectives hope to find him? A Midwestern highway is littered with the bodies of young men. Authorities know the identity of the interstate killer, but can they prove it before he kills again? Spurred on by the thrill of the kill, a serial murderer can't stop on his own. The longer it takes to catch him, the bigger the body count. They started on Halloween 1977. In the foothills just north of Los Angeles, the morning light brought a resident of a quiet suburban neighborhood a glimpse of horror. Sprawled in his front yard was a naked woman. She was dead. Not wanting his children to see the body, he covered her with a tarp. Detective Frank Salerno was one of the first inspectors to arrive.
When I initially got the call, I was told that it may be an overdose. As soon as I saw the body, it appeared to me without a doubt that it was a murder, not a drug overdose of any type.
There were ligature marks around her neck, wrists, and ankles, indicating that the woman had been tied up and strangled to death. She had also been raped. Police had no idea who she was or where she had come from. The only possible clue found at the scene was a small piece of white fiber on the victim's eyelid. It wasn't much, but it was all authorities had to work with. But Detective Salerno noticed one more thing that would be crucial to their search. It was the way the body lay.
She looked like she'd been placed at the location. She didn't look like she had been tossed. It actually looked like maybe two people had carried her, maybe lifted her out of a trunk, lifted her from the bed of a pickup truck or something, and one had carried her from underneath her armpits and one had carried her from underneath her legs and placed her there. So it was just an overall impression that we may be dealing with two people.
Investigators assumed this brutal strangling and the killer's careless disposal of the body was an isolated incident, just another unfortunate murder in Los Angeles. But the Halloween murder was only the beginning. Less than a week later, a jogger happened upon the nude body of a woman lying in plain sight beside the jogging path. With the second body, a deadly pattern began to emerge. Both victims had been raped, strangled, and dumped out in the open for anyone to find. Both bodies were practically on display, disposed of on slight inclines or hills.
The only difference was that you had different bodies, but you had the same marks on the wrist in the same locations. You had the same marks on the ankles, almost to the inch of where they were on each body. You had the same mark on the throat, the same ligature mark. So at that point we knew that we had a single killer or killers that were at least responsible for two murders.
But the murders didn't stop there. The press, unaware that authorities were searching for two suspects, dubbed the killer the Hillside Strangler. On November 20th, a 9-year-old boy was playing near his house when he spied what he thought were two mannequins. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were not. Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Johnson had been missing for over a week before their bodies were found. They weren't even 15 years old. The crime fit the strangler's pattern to a T, except in this instance, there was a witness. A boy had seen the girls on the day of their disappearance. Once they got off the bus, he noticed they stopped to talk to someone in a car. He didn't see the stranger's face, but remembered the car was a large sedan. The girl's principal also gave police some useful information. She knew the girls personally and insisted that with the ever-present scare of the Hillside Strangler, the girls would probably not have gone anywhere with a stranger, unless that stranger was masquerading as a policeman. Tension in the city and within the police force became palpable, and officers stepped up their efforts to find the killers, whoever they might be.
We were spending 7 days a week, 12, 15 hours a day working. That didn't slow down ever.
Police had only hunches and few clues about the Hillside Strangler. They weren't sure if they were looking for one man or two, or whether the killer was truly an officer or just posing. Only one thing was certain. With each passing night, more women would die. November 28th. The killers did not take Thanksgiving off. When Lauren Wagner's parents realized she hadn't come in from the night before, they panicked. Even more disturbing was the fact that her car was parked out front. Whatever happened to Lauren took place after she got home. Officers canvassed the neighborhood looking for any lead that might point them to a suspect.
Heard anything, seen anything suspicious in the area?
One neighbor recalled seeing Lauren pull up around 9 p.m., followed by another car. Two men jumped out and started arguing with her. The witness told investigators they didn't look like police. Even so, Lauren got into the car with them and drove off. Her body was found the next day. In addition to the strangler's telltale markings, some small fibers were found on Wagner's body. They didn't match the fiber found on the first victim. After 9 brutal murders, it was only the second time any evidence was collected from a victim. Police continued to scour the streets, but with nothing more than a vague description of the suspect's car, there was not much to go on, and absolutely no way to match the fibers with the killer. The witness's report did, however, confirm the police's theory of 2 killers, and authorities now believe the men were merely posing as police. Six weeks later, the body of an 18-year-old prostitute turned up. This time, the killers were toying with police, like a cat with a mouse. They dumped the body on a hillside with City Hall as a backdrop.
But it just seemed like they were trying to give us a message that they were still operating. They were operating with impunity. They could do whatever they wanted when they wanted.
Police searched the apartment the prostitute had gone to that night and found fingerprints that they thought might belong to the killer, but they didn't come up with any matches in their databases. Then, as suddenly as the murders began, they stopped. With such little evidence to go on, there was not much detectives could do but sit and wait. After 4 months of terror in Los Angeles, an eerie calm fell over the city. The killers were still out there, but no one knew when or where the hillside stranglers would strike next.
We don't have quotas. You can write as many as you want.
In Bellingham, Washington, January 1979, a man reported that his girlfriend and her roommate were missing. He told police they were supposed to be house-sitting for an acquaintance who worked as a security guard.
We all know him pretty well. That's all I've got. Do you guys have enough?
Investigators went to the women's apartment. From the moment he arrived, Bellingham Police Chief Terry Mangan knew that Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick were in danger.
And it was evident as soon as we got there that something was terribly wrong, in the sense that they had left Diane Wilder's car there with some groceries in it, some of which needed to be refrigerated. The cat had not been fed or let out, and the lights were on.
In a situation like this, it's difficult to discern what might be a clue. Police collected what they could, including a business card for a security guard named Kenneth Bianchi, and a message in Diane Wilder's handwriting that said he'd called. Bianchi seemed like an obvious suspect, but when police interviewed him, he denied knowing the women or of any house-sitting arrangement. He told them that he was at a law enforcement class that night, training to become a member of the sheriff's reserves.
Scott, X30, you copy?
Hours later, police received the call they were dreading. A car had been discovered near a deserted construction site. Inside were 2 bodies, Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick. They had been strangled. Detectives determined that the murders most likely took place somewhere else, and whoever had left the bodies there had taken careful measures to clean up after himself. Authorities had trouble lifting fingerprints off the car. It had been wiped clean.
Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick, both of them Western Washington students.
Bellingham police criminalist Bob Knudsen processed the scene.
Leaving Fred Myers at about 7 o'clock. This was, in our opinion, definitely not a first-time killer. This is somebody who had been there before.
But no matter how expert a killer is, chances are he'll leave a trace of himself behind. A single hair that did not belong to either of the women gave detectives some hope of linking the crime to a suspect. On one of the women's shoes and clothes were fuzzy gold fibers, most likely from a carpet. Locating the source might lead investigators to the murder site. Though finding a gold carpet would be no problem, the chances of finding the right one were slim. Detectives checked on an address found in the glove box. As the examination continued, authorities found something else. Stuck to the underside of the car were sprigs of fresh heather. Police brought the car to the lab to study the underside more closely. They found several fresh scrapes on the gas tank. Investigators speculated that when the killer threw the bodies into the car, the weight forced the back of the vehicle down onto a rock or something similar. The killer may have scraped the gas tank as he pulled away. A rock, a sprig of heather, and some gold carpet fibers. The perfect ingredients for a mystery. But how to solve it?
I have some update on the missing girls, the co-ed case. Control. We'll get the volunteers out.
The address in the glove box led to an empty, locked house with gold carpeting. To obtain a key, police contacted the security company that monitored it. It was the same security company that Kenneth Bianchi worked for. They told police that the key was missing from their file. While the paperwork allowing them to enter the house was being processed, investigators examined the grounds.
But there was some heather and bushes and things there, and Bob Knudsen pushed, as I recall, pushed the heather aside, he and Terry White, and there were scrapes, fresh scrapes on the rock under the heather, which subsequently matched the scrapes in the gas tank in the bottom of the car.
Yep, it's a good match. Now, all we got to do now is finish photoing the rock, get it ready for court.
Inside the house, investigators found hair from 3 persons. 2 matched the victims. The 3rd matched the unknown hair also found in the automobile. The car, the 2 women, and a 3rd person had been at the house. And the only people who had access to the house while the owners were away were the employees of the security company. Once again, police turned to Kenneth Bianchi. Authorities obtained a warrant to search Bianchi's house for clues to the murder. What they found instead was a basement full of stolen goods. The stolen property was enough grounds to arrest Bianchi and hold him until police could gather evidence to link him to the murders. Investigators later learned that he never showed up at his law enforcement class on the night Wilder and Mendick disappeared. Police had no trouble finding him on patrol at his security job. Forensic specialists matched the foreign hairs found in the car and the house in Washington to Bianchi. Undoubtedly, he had been at these locations. Though confident that Bianchi would prove to be their man, investigators had no idea who they actually had on their hands. A California driver's license found in his possession prompted a call to the Los Angeles authorities to check on prior offenses. The detective that took the call was part of the Hillside Strangler task force and recognized the similarities.
Yeah, I'm sitting down.
It was the call Detective Frank Salerno had been waiting 2 long years to receive.
You're kidding me. Not only did he live next door and across the street from 2 of our victims, but he had lived on Tamarind, which was the Kimberly Martin case. So right away, we've got a guy that's connected by location to 3 of the victims, and we never had that before.
Hair found in his car in Washington State matched 2 of the hillside victims in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Bianchi's fingerprints also linked him to the murder of the prostitute. Faced with undeniable evidence, Bianchi confessed to the hillside stranglings and named his cousin, Angelo Bono, as his accomplice.
Well, we took all the evidence, which amounted to 1 tuft of fiber and 1 clump of fiber, and we served a search warrant on Angelo Bono's house and his trim shop.
A search of Bono's car upholstery shop brought an exact match of the white fibers found on 2 of the hillside victims.
When I pick her up, you get it.
The cousins explained how they found their targets, cruising the streets of Hollywood posing as undercover cops. Some of the victims were prostitutes who were easy to lure into the car. Others were simply stopped and arrested on bogus charges. Once a woman was in the car, she was handcuffed and taken to Bono's shop, where she'd be tied up, raped, and strangled to death. Then, it was just a matter of disposing of the body under cover of darkness.
Just stand
On the corner by yourself,
on the
just
corner
like that.
Yeah.
California, instead of Washington, are giving up the death penalty.
How does a defendant plead to count 1 of the information?
Guilty, Your Honor.
How does a defendant plead to count 2 of the information?
Guilty.
Bianchi pled guilty to 2 first-degree murders in Washington and confessed to 10 murders in California. He and Angelo Bono are currently serving multiple life terms without parole. Many consider big cities to be havens for violence and murder. But the truth is, there's no law that keeps serial killers within city limits. In October 1980, some hikers were enjoying the serene beauty of Mount Tamalpais State Park in Northern California when they made a gruesome discovery. The body of a young woman lay flat on the ground. She had been shot in the head and raped. Police arrived to process the scene. The victim was 26-year-old Ann Alderson. She'd gone to the park to meditate the day before and had not returned. Detective Rich Keaton of the Marin County Sheriff's Department led the investigation.
The park is almost like a sanctuary, and it has kind of a reverence in it, and overlooking San Francisco Bay. And to have such a violent crime occur in a pristine area was just out of the ordinary.
There was not much evidence at the scene. Traces of biological material found around the body and the bullets removed from the victim were sent to the crime lab in Santa Rosa with the hopes that they might point to a suspect. Forensic specialist Mike Waller set out to determine what type of weapon was used in the murder.
By evaluating the bullet under a stereo microscope such as what I have here, and by looking at the class characteristics and measuring them, we can get an idea of a potential model or make in some cases. And one weapon that was a possibility in this case turned out to be what is known as a Rossi .38 special revolver.
We've done the aerial photos. We put up
Without a suspect or weapon, the identification provided no help. Investigators had no choice but to shelve the case until more information turned up. They didn't have long to wait. A month after the murder, detectives were searching for 2 missing women on the trails at Point Reyes National Seashore in Marin County. But they didn't find what they were looking for. 2 bodies, a man and a woman, lay face down in the woods. They had been shot to death. Police surveyed the scene but were disappointed with their findings. They uncovered no footprints. There were no hairs or fibers, only the bullets. While officers finished processing the scene, police found the women they had been looking for. They too were dead. Both women were naked. They had been shot and raped. No fingerprints or other telltale clues were found.
My first impressions were that this was almost a shock that this wasn't really happening. We couldn't have 4 more bodies found in a park of young women and 1 young man who were simply executed for what appeared to be no other reason than sexual violation.
Investigators now had 5 murders and still only a handful of bullets as clues. By examining the barrel marks left on the bullets, Mike Waller confirmed authorities' worst fears. All the bullets recovered from the various scenes had been fired from the same gun. Now there was no question about it. A serial killer was stalking victims in the state parks. But detectives were no closer to finding who he was. Papers called the murderer the Trailside Killer. Detectives knew that a true serial killer wouldn't stop until he was caught, and catching him wouldn't be easy. The killer was cunning, the murders well planned. Police hoped that someone may have spied the killer before he made his kills. A task force collected accounts from people who had seen a strange man on the hiking trails earlier in the day. They put together a composite sketch from their descriptions. Investigators also assembled a profile of their suspect based on case histories of similar murderers. He would be a white male, 20 to 25, who was tall and thin, with black hair. He would be good-looking and charming, an outgoing guy with a winning personality. Once the sketch was approved by the task force, flyers were distributed throughout the county to alert the public. Warnings were posted at the state parks, and agents hiked the trails undercover. The FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation. Police were busy hatching an elaborate plan to stop the killer. They called it Code 555. The idea was to immediately shut down all roads leading out of the county the second the next attack was reported. It wouldn't prevent another murder, but it was the only way authorities could see to apprehend a suspect. And something had to be done. The community was frightened to death. The hiking trails became vacant. People quit coming to the parks. The suspect's face was posted everywhere in an effort to warn the people of Marin County. But police were ready. Code 555 could be deployed in a moment's notice. Next time the trailside killer struck, there would be no escape.
Bodies were found on the left-hand side of the mountain.
Like in some fairy tale, in the beautiful mountains of Northern California, there dwelled a monster. Though 4 months had passed without incident, investigators knew the trailside killer wasn't finished. In March of 1981, visitors to Henry Cowell State Park were taking a break at the observation deck when they heard screams.
Help!
A terrified young man was limping up the trail toward them, yelling hysterically. He had been hiking with his girlfriend when a stranger approached and shot them both. His girlfriend was dead, and the killer was still loose in the park. The police arrived in minutes, but the murderer had slipped away undetected. Stephen Hartle was rushed to the hospital. Marin County Police had been ready for the trailside killer, prepared to shut down all exits from the county. It would have worked, except that this latest attack occurred outside their jurisdiction in Santa Cruz County. The trailside killer was on the move.
He took great delight in watching what the police agencies were trying to do, and that he was staying always one step ahead of us, one step ahead of apprehension, and was probably taking great glee into the fact that he was not being identified, not being discovered. And I'm sure that he was reading every news article that came out.
Santa Cruz police found some footprints at the scene and took plaster casts for future comparison. Those and the bullets were almost all the evidence authorities had. But there was one thing the killer didn't count on. Stephen Hartle had survived the shooting. He was an eyewitness. But when police showed him the sketch of the trailside killer, something was horribly wrong. Hartle didn't recognize him. In fact, he was certain his shooter was another man. Authorities now faced the shocking possibility that Hartle and his girlfriend were victims of a copycat. The man Hartle described looked nothing like the killer in Marin County. He was large with broad shoulders. He wore glasses, a mustache, and had thinning hair. And most unlike the trailside killer, this man was 20 or 25 years older. Detectives swiftly distributed the second sketch around the area and redoubled their efforts to catch not one, but two killers.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Then, a call came in to Detective Keaton that set the record straight. The lab had compared the bullets from the Santa Cruz attack to the ones in Marin County. They were a perfect match. The bullets had been fired from the same gun. There was no younger man. The first suspect composite had been a terrible, time-consuming mistake. Authorities had been looking for the wrong man. They quickly dispensed with the first sketch and concentrated on the eyewitness account.
So instead of it being a young white male in his early to mid-20s, we were looking at a male who was actually about 50 years of age.
Hey, hon.
While the hunt continued, people went about their daily lives. Heather Skaggs needed a car. She'd shopped around for a few months with her boyfriend, but had no luck.
It's David Carpenter.
She decided to check out a car that one of her co-workers had found for sale.
Yeah, I've got a number in my purse, because I do need to get going now.
Before she went off, she jotted her co-worker's phone number. His name was David Carpenter.
Yeah, but listen, I'll just talk to
Heather was running a little late and had to rush if she was going to meet Carpenter on time. They said their goodbyes, and then Heather left for the last time. In the morning, when she hadn't come home, her boyfriend turned to David Carpenter for answers.
Okay.
Carpenter hadn't seen Heather or heard from her at all that day. Concerned, her boyfriend went to the police. When police questioned Carpenter, he told them the same story. But his resemblance to the sketch of the trailside killer was difficult to overlook. For 2 weeks, they kept him under surveillance. When a background check revealed that he'd previously been convicted for rape and assault, investigators brought him in. Although the murder weapon was nowhere to be found, investigators retrieved a single .38 caliber bullet from his car. It was rushed to the lab for analysis. Heather Skaggs's body was found a few days later.
You can't see through the glass. Okay.
Stephen Hartle had recovered fully from the attack and was brought in to look at a lineup. He had no trouble picking out the man who had shot him and killed his girlfriend. There was no doubt in his mind that David Carpenter was that man.
Good afternoon.
At long last, authorities believed they had captured the trailside killer. Finally, the parks were safe. The senseless murders would stop. But to make the case, officers still needed to find the murder weapon. Then, police received word from a man in prison who had known Carpenter. He had information to share in exchange for a lighter sentence. He told police that if they searched a certain vacant lot in San Francisco, they'd find Carpenter's gun buried under some rubble. The weapon was sent back to Mike Waller at the lab for final testing and identification.
We got knives, we got guns.
By test firing the gun himself, Waller had bullets to compare with those collected from the murder sites.
Fire in the hole!
When the two were put together, they matched perfectly. Without question, both bullets were fired from the same gun. Police had in their possession the weapon that had killed 7 people. In addition to the ballistics evidence, blood and saliva samples taken from Carpenter matched the biological evidence taken at the first crime scene. And Carpenter had recently purchased a pair of shoes with treads that were consistent with the casts taken from the trails. David Carpenter had little trouble finding and capturing his victims. From a mountain vantage point, he could oversee the trails and make out lone hikers. Knowing exactly where they were headed, he could easily ambush his prey. In execution style, Carpenter shot his victims in the back of the head. David Carpenter was convicted of a total of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of rape. He was given 2 death sentences. Carpenter specifically targeted women for his sexual gratification. Male victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though most serial killers are men, they don't always prey on the opposite sex. In the spring of 1983, a young man was discovered dead in a field off Interstate 294 in Lake County, Illinois, just outside Chicago. He had been bound, tortured, undressed, and stabbed multiple times. It appeared to be an isolated incident. But within a few weeks, another body turned up just off the interstate, less than a mile from the first, and in eerily similar condition. In both cases, detectives could find little at the crime scenes to lead them to the killer. 4 months later, a third victim, Ralph Calise, was found murdered in the same manner along the same stretch of highway where the first 2 victims were found. The press gave the murderer a name, the Interstate Killer. It was at the Calise site that authorities gathered what they hoped would be their first fruitful clues. Most important were footprints and tire tracks. Although not necessarily connected to the murder, it was the first time any type of prints had been recovered. Investigators made plaster casts in case a suspect emerged. Detective Dan Collin knew it would only be a matter of time before he killed again.
When we had the third victim in August, which was Ralph Calise, then we knew we had obviously an individual working the north side of Chicago. If you're still alive over there.
Aware that serial killers often move around to avoid capture, Cullen notified neighboring jurisdictions. When Lake County Police described their victims, authorities in Indiana recognized the pattern all too well. They had been investigating 9 of their own unsolved murders that fit the killer's profile. All the victims had been stabbed in similar fashion and abandoned near highways. The manhunt took on new urgency now that police knew the killer had crisscrossed state lines to murder 12 men.
It's actually right off the map.
In their pursuit of the interstate killer, Indiana and Illinois law enforcement pooled their resources. Acting on a tip, Indianapolis police had singled out one suspect, a man named Larry Eiler, who had been arrested for a similar crime and acquitted. Even as Indiana's #1 suspect, there was no hard evidence against him. Authorities couldn't make a move until he moved first. But when and if he did, they were ready for him. Illinois police had to plaster casts of the footprints and tires taken from their last crime scene. If Indiana authorities could find a way to compare the prints with Eiler's, they were welcome to them. In less than a month, they'd have their chance. On September 30th, 1983, an Indiana state trooper stopped to question 2 men in a truck parked on the side of a road near Interstate 65. The driver explained that they had just stopped for a bathroom break, but the patrolman ran a routine check anyway. He called in the driver's name. It was Larry Eiler.
So what happened was when the state trooper ran his name, one of the dispatchers recognized the name, and from there contacted a detective sergeant with the Indiana State Police, who then said arrest Larry and bring him into custody and bring him to a little station for questioning.
Among the things found in Eiler's truck were a pair of boots, a knife, and a bag of rope. It looked like police had found the interstate killer just in time.
Open the door, please.
Eiler was hauled into custody and subjected to a day of intense interrogation. He remained calm and denied having any knowledge of the murders. But while he was being questioned, investigators were busy gathering evidence from the items seized during the arrest. At the crime lab, examiners processed the evidence that had been confiscated. The tires had been taken off of Larry Eiler's pickup truck and were rolled and printed with the hopes of matching the tread to the plaster casts made at one of the interstate killer's crime scenes. Within days, investigators were confident of their findings. It was the news police had expected. The tire tracks matched perfectly, as did the boot prints. Larry Eiler had been at the scene, and now they had the evidence to prove it in court. But the prints only linked Eiler to the area where the body was found. It didn't prove he had killed Ralph Calise. That information was hidden within other items seized from Larry Eiler at his arrest. The soles of Eiler's boots were caked with dried blood. It matched the blood of Ralph Calise. A knife found in the truck also showed minuscule traces of his blood. With such conclusive evidence, investigators were sure they had their man. They charged Larry Eiler with the murder of Ralph Calise and set about preparing for the trial. It looked like the end of the interstate killer. It wasn't. All the evidence amounted to nothing.
Evidence was thrown out because of what's known as the exclusionary rule, the fruit of the poisonous tree. You can't illegally seize evidence and then use it against somebody.
Apparently, the sergeant answering the officer's call mistook the routine surveillance alert out on Eiler for a detention order. He had been arrested unjustly. Even in the face of indisputable forensic evidence, nothing could stick unless the proper procedures had been followed. The bloody knife, the boots, and the tire track were ruled inadmissible. Eiler was released. Police would have to start over. Eiler was guilty, and he was free. All that authorities could do was helplessly watch and wait until he tried to kill again. The Illinois police attempted to maintain surveillance on Larry Eiler, not only to prevent another murder, but also hoping that he would slip up and leave behind some evidence they could use. But constant surveillance was impossible.
People can say that, well, why didn't the police watch him? There's no way that we can put, men around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, watching somebody. It's almost impossible to do. While people are going around their normal, everyday life. We couldn't do it. So it was a matter of when was Larry going to kill again? And Danny Bridges was our answer.
In August of 1984, a janitor at a Chicago apartment building watched a man from a neighboring building dump some garbage bags into the wrong dumpster. This had happened too many times before, and the janitor took it upon himself to remove the bags from his building's trash receptacle. But as he lifted the bag, it tore, exposing the horror within. A human leg protruded through the plastic. When police responded, they recognized the address of Eiler's apartment building right next door. The trash bags contained the dismembered body of a young man identified as Danny Bridges. Even though this was not the interstate killer's style, authorities were certain the bags would eventually lead back to Eiler. The trash bags were sent to the forensics lab at the Chicago Police Department. Forensic investigator James Doran was in charge of the examination.
We paid particular attention to the plastic bags in which the dismembered body parts were in. And the reason for that is we felt if we could develop any type of impression or a latent fingerprint on here, we could tie this up to a suspect.
The bags were fumed to bring out any prints. Doran discovered several perfect sets. To no one's surprise, they belonged to Larry Eiler. Investigators had him once again, right where they wanted him. This time they were meticulous. The evidence was unquestionable. All procedures had been followed.
Yeah, well, I think the one that
Eiler's interstate reign of terror was over. Or so they thought.
All right. Bye.
When Eiler was questioned, he explained that he'd thrown some things in the dumpster and had to move a few bags to make room. Apparently, he said, he must have moved the body bags. Authorities knew he was lying, but the truth was, anyone could have touched those bags once they were in the dumpster. His simple alibi was airtight. Once again, it looked like the interstate killer was going to walk away scot-free. Hoping to bag a killer, the trash bags that contained the body parts were fumed for fingerprints again, this time on the inside. There, in one of the bags, forensic expert James Doran found a single print left by Larry Eiler.
I mean, there are no two people in this world with the same fingerprints to date. And unless Larry Eiler could explain away why he had his thumbprint, fingerprint, on the inside of that bag containing the part of Danny Bridges, we had the person who killed Danny Bridges.
Armed with a single fingerprint, police arrested Eiler at his apartment and charged him with the murder of Danny Bridges. Once more, authorities had Eiler in custody, but this time they were going to make sure that he wasn't released. Every inch of the apartment would need to be examined in order to build a foolproof case to take to court. Initially, investigators found the apartment virtually spotless. But as they began to probe, they uncovered pieces of a puzzle that told of a grisly murder. The story of Danny Bridges' death was found in bits of evidence collected throughout the apartment. An awl discovered in the bedroom was found to have small traces of human blood on it. Although the samples were too minute to match to the victim, investigators felt it was probably the weapon that caused the punctures found in his body. The frame of a hacksaw that detectives believe was used to cut up the body was also found to contain traces of human blood. But again, it wasn't enough blood to link to Danny Bridges. For such a violent crime to have occurred in such a confined space, authorities were surprised to find the apartment so clean. Detectives supposed that if the body was dismembered in the apartment, the killer would have done it in the bathroom. They took up the threshold, hoping to find some blood that Eiler wouldn't have thought to clean up. Their hunch was right. Underneath the bathroom threshold was enough dried blood to be tested. It was sent to the lab. To get a clearer picture of how the murder transpired, investigators switched off the lights. Luminol is a chemical that glows on contact with even the faintest traces of blood. When detectives sprayed the mixture, the truth shone through. The brutality of the crime left its stains throughout the apartment. Microanalyst Marion Caporuso was responsible for extracting trace evidence at the scene.
When we were doing the luminol processing, although we knew that there was blood at the area, there were none of us that were really prepared for the scope of the amount of blood that was present, the pattern of the wipes. I think there was an audible sigh as we realized that the luminol processing gave us such insight into how the crime scene was actually cleaned up.
The blood samples were analyzed to determine if they matched Danny Bridges or if they were from some other unfortunate victim. At the time, DNA testing was not available.
The type of testing that could be done in the mid-1980s was genetic marker testing. I did an analysis in 6 genetic marker systems and determined that in fact the blood under the threshold did match the type of Danny Bridges. That particular combination of types occurred in 3% of the Caucasian population.
That level of precision, coupled with the other evidence, was enough to convict Larry Eiler of murdering Danny Bridges. He was sentenced to death. Eventually, he confessed to killing 22 others over 4 years. On August 21st, 1994, he picked up Danny Bridges outside a bar. But instead of driving to a remote outdoor area, this time Eiler took the young man home. After tying him up, Eiler stabbed and tortured his victim. He had to drag the body to the tub in order to cut it into pieces small enough to dispose of. Blood covered the apartment. Though he'd taken careful measures to clean up, the stains of his guilt were indelible. Even after a serial killer is caught, his motives remain elusive. Experts know only that these murderers are relentless in their drive to kill. Investigators are equally relentless in their mission to stop serial killers. Though the crimes are enormous, success often hinges on a series of tiny clues the killer leaves in his wake. A woman tests positive for arsenic poisoning just in time to save her life. But others before her weren't so fortunate. Now investigators must build a case on cremated remains. Doctors watch helplessly as a man wastes away and dies. Detectives diagnose it as murder. And unless they can stop it, it may be going around. A young woman is killed in a tragic riding accident, but a series of subtle clues leads investigators to believe that this tragedy was really no accident. Most victims are poisoned by someone they trust, done in by a fatal lapse of judgment, but it only takes investigators a whisper of suspicion to detect a taste of poison. In March of 1988, in the rural town of San Angelo, Texas, paramedics responded to a call at the home of Lita and Algie Nobles.
Hey.
Lita told the paramedics that she and Algie had both been suffering from a stomach flu. Algie had refused to go to the hospital. 3 days after the onset of his symptoms, Lita found Algie unconscious. Paramedics pronounced him dead. Lita Nobles had been nursing her sick husband for months. He'd been in a car accident that should have claimed his life. With a shattered jaw, he could only eat baby food.
About time. What kind of garbage is this?
Algie's convalescence was far from peaceful. He and Lita fought like cats and dogs.
All the time.
Well, you just don't know what it's like.
Despite the tension, he seemed to be making a swift recovery. Lita wasn't faring as well. The stress of tending to her quarrelsome husband aggravated her ulcers. She lived on antacids. 2 months after Algie's death, a close friend, Tim Scoggin, brought Lita to the hospital. She complained of extreme fatigue, vomiting, and stomach pains. She had lost a large amount of blood. Doctors believed an ulcer was to blame, but treatment didn't improve her condition. Weeks passed. Her condition worsened.
Problems with ulcers in the past. You feel anything there?
Then her hands and feet became paralyzed. Looking for a cause, doctors ran a battery of tests, including a screen for heavy metal poisoning.
I think what we're going to have to wait for is that blood test to come back and it should know.
A urinalysis came back positive. Lita Nobles had arsenic in her body. The Texas Rangers were contacted. Investigator George Frazier's first job was to eliminate environmental contamination as the source of the toxin.
When we first started the investigation, all that we knew was that there was presence of arsenic in the body of Lita Nobles. So in the process of elimination, to find out where she got this poison, we tested her water well. Her house was on a water well.
Arsenic is a poisonous metal found naturally in the earth. Because it is an element, it can't break down. But its atoms can combine to form other compounds. A little arsenic has a lot of killing power. In rural Texas, it was once used as a cotton defoliant. Through runoff, it could contaminate a water supply. Samples from the Nobles' home were taken and tested. The well was clean. Investigators questioned Lita's brother and sister-in-law, who stayed at the house after Algie's death. Neither of them suffered any symptoms, even though they had eaten all of their meals there. And yet, during that time, Lita grew progressively sicker, suggesting she'd been repeatedly exposed to the arsenic. As investigators eliminated every possible source of accidental contamination, they came to one grim conclusion. Lita Nobles hadn't been randomly poisoned. She had been targeted for murder. Someone wanted her to die.
Are you using?
Investigators questioned her about who might want her dead.
Well, nothing to speak of except what's out in the garage, insecticides and things like that.
She pointed the finger at her deceased husband.
Our first suspect in Lita's poisoning was Algie, because she felt like they were an older couple, and they had a lot of times that they just quarreled and bit at each other, seemed like all the time. And she first told us that if she had been poisoned, he did it. And so we had to eliminate him as a suspect, even though he was already dead.
To find out whether Algie had had a hand in his wife's illness, detectives needed to know whether she'd been poisoned before or after his death. The victim's hair, they believed, would answer that question. Arsenic stays in hair and fingernails long after it has left the bloodstream. By analyzing those traces, forensic scientists would be able to determine how and when Lita had been poisoned. And if they knew that, they'd have a better idea of who tried to kill her. At Texas A&M University, research chemist Dennis James uses a nuclear reactor to determine the precise amount of trace elements in a given sample. The process is called neutron activation analysis.
Neutron activation analysis is capable of testing for a lot of different types of materials. Some of those are poisonous and some of those aren't. It is particularly sensitive to transition metals and some of the heavy metals in particular.
Lita's hair was cut into 6 segments, each representing about a month of hair growth. By comparing the amount of arsenic in each segment, scientists could build a timeline showing when each dose was consumed and how much arsenic it contained. The canister containing the samples is shuttled to the core. There, it is exposed to nuclear energy for 6 hours, during which time some of the elements in the samples absorb subatomic particles and become unstable. Once removed from the reactor, the elements decay, losing the extra subatomic particles. As they do so, they emit a distinct burst of energy called a gamma ray. Using a gamma ray detector, technicians look for arsenic's signature emission. By comparing the readings from the hair snippets to that of the control samples, they can calculate the concentration of arsenic in each sample. Each snip of Lita Noble's hair, progressing from tips to scalp, showed an increasing amount of arsenic. Lita's dosage had gradually increased over at least 6 months. By administering moderate amounts of arsenic over that length of time, the killer had inadvertently given Lita a tolerance for the poison, which he tried to overcome with a whopping dosage shortly before Lita was hospitalized. The poison had been administered after Algie was buried. He couldn't have been the culprit, but he may have been a victim. Though Algie's hair was too short to tell scientists how long he'd been poisoned, tissue samples taken from his body showed that he, like his wife, endured a massive dose of arsenic. The toxin was found throughout his organs. Finding the poisoner wouldn't be as easy as finding the poison. Someone with access to the elderly couple had, over time, been administering toxic doses of arsenic into their food or drink. That meant that the murderer was probably someone close to the Nobles. Someone they trusted. Investigators faced the delicate task of asking the victim's friends to point out who among them might be a poisoner. a neighbor had a suggestion.
This next door neighbor felt that a young man named Timothy Scoggin was a very likely suspect because he spent a lot of time in their home.
New in town, Scoggin was a well-liked member of the San Angelo community. Best known for his skill as a porcelain painter and his willingness to help the town's senior citizens with errands and odd jobs. He was a mortician by trade, but appeared to be doing well in a series of business ventures. And he loved to make himself useful. Among the elderly people he helped were Lita and Algie Nobles. Shortly after befriending them, he had purchased their air conditioning business. Although he was chronically behind in his mortgage payments, Lita's faith in this surrogate son never wavered. After Algie's death, Lita had relied heavily on him. To Frazier, Scoggin fit the profile of a poisoner. First of all, he had motive. He owed the victims $100,000. Secondly, he had access to the Nobles' home. Finally, he had his victims' undying trust.
After we suspected Timothy Scoggin, we went and talked to Mrs. Nobles and interviewed her in the hospital room. She practically ran us out. She liked this guy. He was coming to the hospital room and doing her hair and doing her nails.
But it wouldn't be long before Frazier could expose the greed beneath Scoggin's angelic demeanor. He learned that during the time of Lita's hospitalization, there had been a lot of suspicious activity in her bank account. While she lay in bed, nearly $48,000 in personal checks had been written to Tim Scoggin. Suspicious for a woman who had no use of her hands.
She has these rubber bands and braces on her hands and couldn't sign her name if she wanted to. So we passed those checks in front of her and asked her how she signed those. And that was enough to convince her that he was the one.
But check forging doesn't prove homicide. If detectives were going to turn their suspicion into a murder charge, they'd need to know more about what made Tim Scoggin tick. A probe into his past convinced investigators that his penchant for poisoning didn't start with Lita and Algie Nobles.
And it's very nice, sure.
Investigators learned that before moving to San Angelo, Tim Scoggin had lived with two elderly sisters who had died suddenly within days of each other. Scoggin boasted he'd probably be inheriting a small fortune from these deceased aunts.
Well, thank you very much.
But the true story was far different than the version Scoggin had been spreading around town.
They were not aunts. They weren't any kin to Timothy Scoggin. However, interestingly enough, he had been kind of a houseboy, an errand boy for them, and had lived with them off and on for a long time.
As he had done with the Nobles, Scoggin endeared himself to Catherine and Cordelia Norton.
Thought this might pick up your spirits a little bit.
Just 5 weeks before Algie Nobles succumbed, both sisters were dead. In February, Scoggin had taken Catherine Norton, a diabetic, to the hospital for a checkup after her surgery for cancer of the pancreas.
Cordelia!
When they returned home, Cordelia became violently ill. He quickly shuttled the older sister to the hospital.
Oh, my.
Scoggin and Catherine returned home and went to sleep.
Thanks so much, and you have a good night.
Scoggin stayed at the house in case Catherine needed anything. In the morning, Scoggin checked on Catherine and, finding her unresponsive, called her doctor. He pronounced Catherine dead. The next day, Cordelia died in her hospital bed. Both deaths were ruled natural causes.
No, I think probably he's already...
6 months after the deaths of the Norton sisters, investigators wanted to know if they, like the Nobles, had been poisoned by arsenic. Problem was, Catherine and Cordelia Norton had been cremated. Investigators learned that Tim Scoggin had used his expertise as a mortician to destroy any evidence of foul play in the deaths of the Norton sisters.
He used that knowledge to know how to forge orders for cremation, which he presented on both of these ladies and said that they had personally requested from him that they be cremated as soon as they had died. And they were promptly cremated and buried.
Investigators now were faced with the task of detecting poison in ashes. No one had ever tried this before. If scientists could navigate this uncharted territory, they'd be one step closer to catching a murderer. The ashes of Cordelia and Catherine Norton were brought to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory, where toxicologist Rod McCutcheon was asked to analyze them chemically. He was initially doubtful about his chance of success.
I really didn't think there would be much of a chance to find any poison in cremation remains. I'd never heard of anyone trying to do this. After reflecting a minute about the particular poison he was interested in, the arsenic, I realized that there was some possibility that the arsenic may still be present because it's an element, and an element will not change.
To test for the presence of arsenic, McCutcheon placed the cremated remains in an acidic solution, then heated it. Impurities are burned away. If there is any arsenic, it remains in the liquid. Chemicals are added to turn the arsenic into a gas. It bubbles through a liquid which turns purple in the presence of arsenic. The more arsenic in the sample, the more intense the color. The tests showed that Cordelia's remains contained lethal amounts of arsenic. Catherine's remains showed none. The negative findings in Catherine's ashes actually bolstered the case by serving as a control. Since both sisters had died on the same day and had been cremated in the same oven, the lack of arsenic in one of the samples proved that the ashes were not contaminated by the burning process. Neutron activation analysis confirmed the findings. Detectives began their pursuit of Scoggin by seeing if he had purchased arsenic. They visited the local grocery store.
There's nobody in there, Farm. Can I help you? Yes.
Here, Tim Scoggin's love of familiarity would strike against him. The clerk told detectives that he remembered Scoggin buying a large amount of rat poison shortly before any of the victims died. The primary ingredient of rat poison is arsenic. Investigators deduced that Scoggin had mixed the poison with products that he knew only his victims would eat: Algie's baby food and Litazat acid. Since he regularly delivered their groceries, he could have mixed up the rat poison before bringing them over. To test their hunch, investigators searched the Nobles' cabinets and refrigerator. Most of the food had been thrown away, but a few of Litazat acids were still around. A single bottle of the medicine tested positive for arsenic. Based on the scientific evidence, law enforcement was ready to take Tim Scoggin into custody.
The real strong thing that made the case for us was the work done in the laboratories. Of course, there's no other way we'd have ever found arsenic in those ashes nor in the body of Mr. Nobles. And so the people who did the forensic work really are the ones who turned the crank in this case for us. We'd probably still be working on it if it hadn't been for them finding this heavy metal poison.
Scoggin was arrested for the murder of Algie Nobles and the attempted murder of Lita. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And even though there was no direct proof that he killed Catherine Norton, investigators believe he tampered with her insulin dosage. He subsequently pleaded guilty to the murders of both sisters and was given 2 50-year sentences. The horrifying truth is that poisoners often get away with their crimes, at least for a while. But vigilance and persistence are strong antidotes to a poisoner's toxic schemes. On November 1st, 1982, paramedics in St. Peters, Missouri were summoned to the home of Lloyd and Shirley Allen. 40-year-old Lloyd Allen had been sick for months with an undiagnosed illness. That morning, his wife said, he became violently ill, then lost consciousness. The coroner believed that he died from natural causes, but he couldn't be sure. On the death certificate, cause of death remained blank. A few days later, Detective Robert Birding of the St. Charles County Sheriff's Department learned of a series of anonymous calls phoned into the local news station. Lloyd Allen hadn't died a natural death, the tipsters said. He'd been poisoned.
A canvass of Lloyd Allen's neighbors was initiated, and it was subsequently learned that the anonymous phone calls came from one or more of Lloyd's neighbors.
Detective Birding did a routine follow-up to see if the phone calls had any merit. Meantime, authorities prevented the body from being buried, pending investigation.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Sergeant Birding of the St. Charles County Sheriff's.
The neighbors told police that the timing of his illness was suspicious. Lloyd's health and behavior changed drastically after his new wife and her daughters moved in. To investigators, these neighborly observations didn't seem like much at first, hardly the kind of information to hang a murder investigation on. But they prompted police to ask more questions about the Allen family. Friends and neighbors told police that problems began shortly after Shirley and Lloyd married in the fall of 1981. Everyone was pleased that Lloyd, a sociable and generous man, had finally found the love and companionship he'd been looking his whole life for. It was his first marriage, but Shirley's fourth. After the wedding, Lloyd brought Shirley Allen and her two daughters, 15-year-old Norma and 12-year-old Paula, into his home. Now he had an instant family to banish the loneliness and a true soulmate in his new wife.
Norma? Norma? Norma?
But winter brought stress and unhappiness to the family.
Go on back to your room.
Norma ran away from home several times and eventually landed in juvenile detention. The marriage grew strained. Then Lloyd started feeling sick. Lloyd went from doctor to doctor. None was able to relieve his symptoms or tell him what was wrong. He tried to work around the house and yard, but was too weak to complete any of his projects. Detectives learned that Shirley tried to boost his stamina with an iron supplement drink, but it didn't help. As he grew sicker, she began keeping him away from other people. Suspicions began to center around Lloyd's new wife.
Drink some more.
The neighbors related to us that she was segregating him from neighbors. He wouldn't be seen out very much. He wouldn't be able to acknowledge their hellos and their gestures of greeting because of his poor health. And it appeared to them that Shirley was concealing Lloyd.
Then, finally, she cut him off entirely. A neighbor had come to pick up a wheelbarrow he'd loaned to Lloyd. Concerned about his friend's diminished health, he urged Lloyd to seek another doctor. The conversation was cut short when Shirley arrived. She ushered the neighbor out and later filed a trespassing complaint against him. Shirley's behavior seemed odd, But investigators couldn't hang a murder case on neighborhood gossip. Birding needed to discover a motive. He did.
Shirley was the beneficiary of a $25,000 life policy. And we also learned that she was the beneficiary of Lloyd's will, which had recently been changed.
It is only natural for a wife to be named as her husband's beneficiary. But it was the timing, not the payoff, that gave detectives pause. Lloyd's health began to decline just days after signing the papers. That was something to go on, but not much. It didn't provide the kind of firm foundation detectives required to move forward. Birding hoped that an interview with the suspect would reveal something more, but he was met only with stock answers.
Of course, she gave us some exculpatory statements that Lloyd Allen's death was of natural causes. He's being treated by a variety of physicians for a variety of illnesses that she described to us as depression. There was a litany of medications in the home that she said that he was taking for his treatment.
The fact remained that the victim had continued wasting away with no apparent cause and no evidence of disease. Mrs. Allen was still a suspect. She had motive and opportunity. But investigators had no clues, no witnesses, and no idea what killed Lloyd Allen. Lloyd Allen was dead, and detectives suspected he was poisoned by his wife. But they had no way of proving it. The investigation stalled.
This is in regard to the death of Lloyd Allen.
Then police got a break when a witness came forward.
I don't want to talk over the phone. Is it possible?
4 days after Lloyd's death, Shirley's daughter Norma called the sheriff's department. She told them she was in possession of the poison. Norma backed up her story with some evidence. Inside a brown paper bag, detectives found a wine bottle filled with green liquid. On the label, a handwritten warning read, "Don't drink." A warning that Norma told police her mother asked her to write. Norma said she wasn't sure what was in the bottle, but she suspected it was antifreeze. She told investigators that over the last 2 months, she'd seen her mother giving the liquid to Lloyd. Norma also told police that she'd witnessed her mother mixing gas treatment with sugar and orange food coloring to simulate the iron supplement. On the day of his death, Norma said, Shirley poured him a dose of pure antifreeze and forced him to drink it.
Maybe we should call a doctor.
Guided by Norma's testimony, toxicologists tested the contents of the bottle for antifreeze. A sample of the liquid was injected into the gas chromatograph. The apparatus separates a compound into smaller chemicals so it can be analyzed. Each chemical is displayed as a peak on a graph. The resulting peak was a match for antifreeze, known chemically as ethylene glycol. According to toxicologist Christopher Long of St. Louis University, antifreeze with its sweet taste is a subtle, stealthy killer. The victim might never even realize he's drinking himself to death.
Antifreeze would produce something like having a drink of alcohol. But as far as a burning sensation or anything to warn you, no, it wouldn't. So it'd be the same as maybe if you had a little taste of beer or something like that, only without the flavoring. So you might get just a slight change in how you feel, but nothing really noticeable.
But over time, antifreeze is deadly. As it is metabolized by the body, it produces toxins that raise the acid level of the blood. With each dose, Lloyd Allen's body and mind would slowly be destroyed.
When your body chemistries change and your kidneys aren't working, it's not purifying your blood of the waste products. So that could, in fact, account for why he appeared dizzy or a zombie-like or just plain dull. You know, his mind wasn't working properly.
We can't seem to find
Because so many of Lloyd's organs were failing, it would have been difficult for any doctor to diagnose the poisoning. In the final stages, even if Lloyd knew that the woman he loved betrayed him with poison, he would have been too weak to protect himself and too confused to plea for help. Scientists determined that antifreeze poisoning was consistent with Lloyd Allen's mysterious ailment. To prove it, the body was autopsied and tissue samples were tested. His liver, kidneys, and brain contained crystals formed by the breakdown of massive quantities of ethylene glycol. It was consistent with long-term consumption of the liquid. The coroner ruled Lloyd's death a homicide by ethylene glycol poisoning. Detectives had found their poison. Now they had to be sure about the poisoner.
Well,
Norma was a troubled teenager who'd been at odds with her mother for years. The possibility remained that she had poisoned Lloyd herself to frame her mother. After a series of interviews, that theory was quickly discounted. Norma was truly fond of the victim and had nothing to gain by his death. With the evidence in hand, police arrested Shirley Allen. They were able easily to construct their case against her. A $25,000 life insurance policy gave her the motive to kill her husband. The spiked wine bottle gave her the means. In a trial that lasted only 4 days, she was found guilty of killing Lloyd Allen. Shirley Allen was sentenced to life with no parole for 50 years. She died in prison.
Without the forensics evidence and learning that actually Lloyd Allen's body contained ethyl glycol, we would not have had a homicide investigation. We would not have learned of his death as being a homicide, and Shirley Allen most likely would have gotten away with his death.
Because of the concern of Lloyd Allen's neighbors, a cunning murderer was brought to justice. It wasn't the only time a crime was exposed when nosy neighbors smelled trouble. It was a summer evening in 1980 when David Davis sped to his neighbor's house in Hillsdale, Michigan, pleading for assistance. Davis told his neighbor that he and Shannon, his wife of 10 months, had been riding when her horse reared, sending her tumbling. She had struck her head on a large rock. Injured, but still conscious, she sent him for help. The men arrived to find Shannon Davis unresponsive. Her head was bleeding. Her skin had a bluish cast. They rushed her to the hospital. When she arrived, she had no pulse and her pupils were fixed and dilated. Technicians attempted to resuscitate her, but failed. Doctors determined that she had died of a head injury from the fall. Case closed. But not for long. 2 months later, the incident came to the attention of Michigan State Police Detective Don Brooks. Brooks had heard that Davis's neighbor had refused to let the case die.
The death was ruled to be an accident, but the circumstances were such that he felt this was probably a murder case.
Suspicion took root in the neighbor's mind the day after the death, when he revisited the scene. He noticed that the branches of a nearby tree were marred by 2 circular bruises, suggesting that horses had been tied there. A fresh pile of manure sat 6 feet away, confirming that impression. It appeared that the Davises, the only riders in the area, had stopped here long enough to tie their horses. That didn't fit with Davis's story about the victim's horse bolting and his mad rush to find help. The neighbor, Dick Britton, was also a family friend. But he grew concerned that Davis was hiding something.
First, I felt guilty thinking that way. I kept thinking, well, I got to be wrong. But this went on for quite a while, and you just keep thinking, and things just didn't add up, didn't make sense.
Shannon and David had been married for only 10 months before the accident, wed after only a 7-week courtship. It was love at first sight. After their marriage, Shannon came to live on Davis's farm. He taught her how to ride. To Britton and the victim's family, the account Davis had given didn't fit with the way he'd seen Shannon riding just minutes before the accident. She was a cautious rider with a quiet horse. Shannon's parents really didn't know much about their son-in-law, except that he made their daughter happier than they'd ever seen her. After the accident, the victim's parents had clashed with Davis. He wanted to have his wife cremated.
Cremated? No way. Hey, listen.
They insisted on burial, and so Shannon was buried.
And there's a double indemnity.
At the hospital, Davis told Shannon's family that he had no life insurance for her.
The other will benefit by receiving the other.
Honey, don't you think that's a little too much?
But they learned that weeks before her death, the newlyweds had signed a policy.
I have a contract for each of you to
Now, Davis was preparing to collect on it. With double indemnity for accidental death, Davis stood to gain more than $300,000. The family believed that provided 300,000 reasons for Davis to plan a murder. To investigators, it merely looked like a grieving family trying to blame a tragic accident on the victim's new husband. The meddling neighbor was helping to stir them up. Fueled by their suspicions, Shannon's family and Britton urged authorities to reopen the case. 1 month after her death, the victim's body was exhumed. The examination clearly showed a fatal brain injury and bruises consistent with a fall from a horse. A routine drug screen was also conducted, but the physical damage was so compelling that the case was closed a second time, even before the drug screen was completed. Britton and the family would not let the matter rest.
Mr. Britton? Don Brooks in the state police. Oh, glad you come.
The Detroit Free Press published an article on their suspicions surrounding their daughter's death. It prompted the state attorney's office to get involved. Don Brooks handled the case.
I thought to myself, if 50% of this article is accurate, there's a great deal of information to go on, and it's going to be very helpful, and it sure leads one to believe that this is a murder case, not an accident.
For Brooks, the capstone of Britton's argument involved the rock which ended the victim's life. It was the only one in the area. It might have been a freak coincidence that she happened to hit her head on it. But in light of the other evidence, this small detail raised big questions.
The percentage of someone falling off from a horse in that area and happen to hit their head on the only rock around was so high that that itself should have raised a lot of questions.
The closer Brooks looked into the death, the more suspicious he became. He sought the results of the drug screen from the autopsy and learned that it too raised some difficult questions.
pile of horse dung. Then over here.
It was time to seek answers. In the lab, a tissue sample from the autopsy was analyzed by a gas chromatograph. Every substance creates its own peak of a specific length at a specific point. These peaks are called the retention time of the substance. The chromatograph showed a strange chemical in the victim's tissue that matched nothing in the lab's database. No one knew what it was, but before they could pursue it, the case was closed again, and the mystery was buried with the victim. Still convinced that Shannon was murdered, her family pinned their hopes on this mysterious peak, pressuring investigators to study it further. Technicians toiled for weeks, but couldn't identify the compound. They ruled out instrument error. They simulated the conditions of embalming and burial on sample tissues to see if the victim's tissue was contaminated after death. No matter what they did, they couldn't isolate the chemical. All they knew was that there was something in the victim's body that shouldn't have been there. And they had no idea what it was. 4 months after the tragic horseback riding fall that ended Shannon Davis's life, grave suspicions swirled around the so-called accident. Based on the questionable crime scene, the insurance money, and the curious lab results, Brooks was convinced that foul play was involved in the victim's death. Now he had to prove it.
You put it all together, and it was very obvious to me that this was a murder case.
He set his crosshairs on the victim's husband, David Davis. But Davis had moved to Florida. Investigators had no choice but to watch him go. Though the circumstantial evidence was heaped against him, there was no solid proof that he lied about the accident.
Even if I received a confession from Dave Davis, we still had the problem with the autopsy saying that those injuries were consistent with falling off from a horse, striking the head, and the cause of death was the injury to the brain. So that became the challenge of the medical community at that point.
The case teetered on the mysterious chemical peak. Uncovering its relationship, if any, to the victim's death was the last chance detectives had to foil what might otherwise prove to be the perfect crime. Unable to determine what the compound was, Brooks reviewed the other facts of the crime. What he couldn't figure out was how the victim could have been unlucky enough to have struck that solitary rock. Brooks mulled various scenarios over with his colleagues, but none seemed to work. Then, a moment of inspiration struck, revealing a scheme that would tie up all the loose ends and explain the mystery chemical.
If this young lady was paralyzed in some way, you know, her muscular system, her nervous system was paralyzed in such a way where she couldn't resist and he could create the injury he wanted.
Investigators believed that the victim was immobilized before her head was intentionally struck against the rock. They began searching for a chemical that would fit a killer's criteria. A drug that could immobilize quickly, then leave little trace. It would also have to be easy to obtain without rousing suspicion. What could it be, and where would they find it? Since Davis lived on a farm, it was likely that he had access to compounds designed for animals. Detectives interviewed one of the vets employed by Davis. He described a litany of sedatives and tranquilizers. Among them was a drug that seemed a likely candidate. Succinylcholine is a powerful muscle relaxant. In humans, it can paralyze the respiratory system in seconds. Because it breaks down into chemicals naturally found in the body, SCH is considered a nearly perfect murder weapon, one that wouldn't show up in a gas chromatograph. At Brooks's request, toxicologist Tom Carroll of the Medical College of Ohio tested it anyway.
So I immediately went over to our pharmacy, got some succinylcholine, and was able to put it onto the gas chromatograph, and it had the exact same retention time as our unknown peak. Bingo. We thought we had something.
To confirm the results, the chromatograph was recalibrated and the SCH retested a total of 5 times. Each time, the results were identical. But for absolute confirmation, the tissue samples had to be tested on the more sensitive mass spectrometer to see if the chemical could be isolated that way. The samples were sent to 2 labs for fine-tuned analysis. Unfortunately, neither of the mass spectrometers could distinguish the chemical in the victim's tissues. Carroll took the SCH and the tissue samples to Stockholm, Sweden, where scientists were experimenting with methods to analyze chemicals very similar to SCH. Shannon's tissues were tested in the spectrometer there. The initial results were disappointing. Test after test failed to reveal the chemical. If they couldn't find it, then Davis would have committed the perfect crime. Carroll wouldn't allow that to happen. Investigators pressed on. The precision that made the spectrometer so sensitive also made it temperamental. After scores of attempts, a tiny adjustment to the temperature of the equipment brought hard-won success.
Boom. We had found it. And I mean, you talk about a celebration. This was some hooping and hollering that you never believed. From there on out, it was simply a matter of doing more extractions, getting all the data necessary. We were now able to identify it in the tissues.
Now, investigators had to determine how the chemical was introduced into the victim's body. More than a year after her death, the victim was re-exhumed and a new autopsy performed to look for a likely site of injection. It revealed extensive bruising on the left. These injuries told of a hard fall. The right side was uninjured, except for 2 curious marks, one on her shoulder, one on her wrist. These 2 bruises represented the faint tracks of a killer's needle. They had been overlooked before because no one suspected that a needle was used in the crime. As investigators prepared their findings, they thought their long struggle was over. Scientists in Sweden thought they'd found the weapon that killed Shannon Davis in Michigan. Through sheer diligence, they perfected a way to isolate traces of deadly SCH from human tissue. The jubilant team told investigators that they could now arrest the suspect, David Davis.
We told Don Brooks, and we told him back there, we got it. Get him. Can't do that. The method has not been scientifically evaluated yet.
The success of their test relied on an experimental method for preparing the tissue sample. Before a new forensic technique can be accepted in the courtroom, other scientists must evaluate it. The process can take years. But because of the gravity of the case, Carroll's findings were reviewed and published in a matter of weeks. Scientists had successfully proven that SCH had a role in the death of Shannon Davis. Brooks's theory had proved correct. According to the prosecution scenario, Davis set out to kill his wife on their way home from the Britons. He tied the horses, then went after Shannon with a syringe, injecting her twice with the lethal drug.
For that second injection site to be delivered. She would probably have had to have been paralyzed at that point because it was precisely right on the vein. This bruise up here was probably as a result of the struggle while he's injecting her, while she still had some life in her. And that's how I think it. You know, once she goes to the ground and collapses, then he can pick her up and drop her onto this rock, and that will create the effect of falling from the horse.
It was a cleverly thought out plan, undone by the scientific method. Davis staged what he thought was the perfect crime. The only problem was the perfect murder weapon was no longer so perfect. David Davis was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Brooks suspected that Shannon Davis wasn't the first person whose death by SCH poisoning was overlooked. But because of this case, hopefully, she's one of the last.
And so to be a part of an investigation like this, where the medical field basically, or the information about succinyldicholine in the medical field has been rewritten, that's kind of a nice thing to be a part of.
It's impossible to know how many more victims have been killed silently by people they trusted. Poisoners may never lay a hand on their victims, but with advancing forensics techniques, it's getting harder to escape without leaving a print.